Welcome to Adoption Unfiltered, a podcast examining various viewpoints of lived adoption experiences. I'm one of your hosts, Sarah Easterly. I'm an adoptee, and I'm joined by Kelsey Vandervliet Ranyard, a birth parent, and Lori Holden, an adoptive parent. And we invite you to join us as we cover sensitive and timely issues from the perspective of adoptee, birth parent, and adoptive parent. Enjoy today's episode.
Today we are continuing our series, our activist series, and we have a guest here, Greg Luce. Greg is a DC-born adoptee and a Minnesota-based attorney. He's the founder of Adoptee Rights Law Center and the executive director at Adoptees United. He's a passionate advocate for adoptees, and in his work, he helps adult adopted people navigate legal challenges and in obtaining their own original birth certificates, securing U.S. citizenship, and seeking information to which they are entitled. He's also working to develop broader legal strategies to challenge existing legal frameworks that operate to deny adopted people basic and fundamental rights of identity. Greg, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we're excited. We've met just on Zoom and just like in close proximity and doing advocacy work. And I first took notice of Greg's work because we were building Adopt Change and we were looking at Greg's website being like, this guy is crazy with his maps and they're so interactive and we need this for our issues. And so we were super impressed with just the content and how well maintained the website is and how active you are in updating all of the law changes that are happening around the country and how proactive you are in your advocacy work for open records. So I've been a fan from afar, but
No, thanks. Yeah.
we're in proximity to one another. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you do with Adoptee Rights Law Center?
Sure. In Adoptee Rights Law Center, there's two sort of, if you want to call them entities, I work for. One is me, basically, and that's Adoptee Rights Law Center. I'm an attorney. It started out as representing domestically born adoptees, mostly born in Minnesota, because that's where I practiced, in getting their adoption records, typically the original birth record, but often when you're going to court to get that, I would often ask for the court records as well. And it grew out of that. In fact, one of my first cases was to help annul or vacate an adoption, which is kind of odd. I mean, that's the first big case that I had was in Minnesota. But for the most part, I was working on getting birth records for Minnesota-born adoptees. And from there, it started to grow into other areas, including direct advocacy before legislators.
What was the starting point for you with Adoptee Rights Law Center where you first started to take notice of the need for opening people's records?
It really came out of my own experience and being born and adopted in the District of Columbia. And I'm probably a fairly typical adoptee. I didn't really think a ton about my adoption. It was always present as I was growing up. I didn't think a ton more about the depth of it until later in life, generally when I had my first son, which I think is also typical of many adoptees. They begin to think about their origins at that point when they have someone biologically related to them and you're holding them, actually. And so I kind of freaked out at that point. That was when I was around 33 and wanted to know a lot more about who I am and where I came from. I took a trip to DC. Thought I was going to get my records. I thought it would be easy. It turned out it was not easy. It's very expensive. And then I sort of dropped it. But I only dropped that because my birth mother had registered at one of these online registries that used to exist and still exist in some extent. And we happened to be matched. And that was not long after I'd started that request to find my records or quest. And we were reunited within a year of my son's birth, but she died about 6 months after that of metastatic breast cancer. She had been fighting it for about 14 years. And so, I grieved with that. And as adoptees, I think, also do. They sort of step away from that space for a while to figure things out. And I did that. And I finally came back about 10 or 11 years later and said, okay, I'm in a better space now. I'm going to go full on and get my own birth record. And by that time, I had known that I actually had a first birth record, and it wasn't the one that I had after the adoption. And I think a lot of adoptees sometimes don't realize that they have two. And so, obviously by that time I was, I'd been an attorney for a number of years, and I could throw a lot of resources at it for free because I'm my own client. And I filed extensive briefs and researched it and requested everything. I requested my birth record, I requested the court records, I requested the adoption agency records. And obviously my mom was already deceased. I knew who my father was. They wanted to interview him to see if he would consent, and I refused to allow them to do that because I didn't think it was his right to have an opinion on whether I get my records or not. And so that what they ended up doing was redacting his name from all the records, but giving me the adoption agency records and a redacted birth record. Even though I knew who he was, I knew his name, didn't matter. I mean, they still redacted it. It's just kind of dumb. You see a little black mark across where you would fill in the name. And but I was offended by that. And I thought, I deserve an unredacted birth record. And so I appealed it to the Court of Appeals in DC and eventually won my case because they sent it back and essentially ordered the court to release the court records and an unredacted version of my birth record. So that took about 4.5 years of my life to do that. It's not like in the movies where I'm fighting in court every day for 4.5 years. It's a very slow process, actually. But it wasn't until the middle of COVID that I got my original birth record in the mail, and that was an incredibly meaningful moment for me. So, to sit there in my living room and open the envelope, and my wife and then my second son was present there as well. And that's sort of that. I think I've always explained it when I learned, like, for instance, when I found out the name of my birth mother when we were matched on the registry, that was the first time I felt tethered to the earth, meaning that I had in some ways imagined myself floating out there. In fact, I used to imagine my birth parents floating out there as well, and we were all floating. And once I just learned the name, I hadn't met her, I hadn't even seen a picture of her. I felt tethered because this person existed in the world and I knew where she lived. So I was, in many respects, now able to walk on the earth. And that was similar to when I got my birth record, because that was an acknowledgement from the state or in DC that I was born to this person at this place at this time, and verification that I was in this place and was born to this person. And so as I was going through all of that for 4.5 years or so in court, I would say, well, this can't be the way it is across the country. What does everyone else have to do? I thought, this is just unusual, and it wasn't. And as I started to research more and more and look at every state, I was at a point in my life where I could dedicate my life to this work, meaning essentially my wife would subsidize what I do, and I would become an attorney who represented adult adopted people. And I've been doing that since 2017 now, but it's grown into direct advocacy at legislative in legislative arenas, and also representing intercountry adoptees who lack U.S. citizenship or don't have proof of U.S. citizenship. So that's the long story, and it's basically motivated by my own experience.
I love that visual of being tethered to the earth. I've never heard it put that way, but it makes so much sense.
Right. It's so often so hard to explain. But I think that's the feeling I had.
I had recurring nightmares about tornadoes and getting swept away. And I think it's similar where I didn't feel grounded. This was my childhood recurring nightmare. I just felt like I was swirling around. So I could totally
Well,
relate.
I grew up
Right.
in Tornado Alley in Oklahoma, so I had real fears of tornadoes.
I did too. I was in
Yeah,
Colorado, not quite
yeah, there you
like you
go. Yeah,
had, but yeah,
right.
they were
Yeah,
founded in something real. Yeah.
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 So talk to me more about your advocacy work with Adoptees United, because you guys are, first of all, you're absolutely killing the email newsletters for one.
Oh,
I think
awesome.
that does that. And every time we get it, I'm like, man, we need more staff because the emails are killing it. And it's so succinct and so just that's really a shout out to Shauna. I know I'm pretty sure Shauna does the newsletters, but you guys are kind of like a well-oiled machine in how you you've got your tentacles in all the states, and you're bill tracking like crazy, and you're putting your people where they need to be for constituent power as well. And so talk to me more about that.
It's interesting with the newsletter. I mean, I'll tell you a secret. I do the newsletter. Shauna's name is on it. And that became because sometimes I have resources on my law firm site that would be good in the newsletter. And it didn't make sense to promote my law firm through Adoptees United. And so the way it works is I put the newsletter together and then I send it to the board, and then the board looks it over and says, okay, it looks good. And then we send it out. So that's what we do. But I love doing that newsletter. It's good to hear that people read it because you never know. And I try to find the most interesting articles that aren't in the mainstream media that have this happy-go-lucky narrative of adoption. There's plenty of those. And so I sometimes fear that it has more negative stories than positive, but that's just what we find.
What area of law were you practicing before you got into adoptee rights?
I did all sorts of stuff. I did employment litigation, I did family law, I did landlord tenant for quite a bit. I would represent tenants who were getting evicted. I worked for legal aid. I've never really held a solid job for more than 5 years because I jumped around wanting to do all sorts of stuff. So the Adoptee Rights Law Center is actually the longest one I've had.
Okay.
And in that whole employment history, I ran a nonprofit that organized tenants, and so I think that really shaped how I view working with people who are often marginalized or disenfranchised,
Totally.
and also how to run a nonprofit generally. So that
Yeah.
all of that kind of went into. I mean, it's like I was made to do this in some ways, and I feel it's my life's calling. It exhausts me, of course, and sometimes it feels just consuming, all consuming. And so that's where you have to worry about burnout, and you have to kind of step away for a little bit or say no to things and say, no, I can't do that. But it is very much was influenced by all sorts of things, including my own experience. And that's the origins of it all.
I was going to ask you, Greg, does each case feel personal in a way?
You know, it's hard to answer as an attorney because you're supposed to be this sort of, calm and, disinterested, and you're going to look out for the best interests of your client. I'd say that it motivates me to get to do well because it makes such a big difference to my clients. And I also think that it helps a ton that they know that I'm also an adopted person who had issues with whatnot, with records or anything else, because I think that they just assume that I'm not. But when I tell them I am, they understand, and I get it. I get, as we all know, you get it as an adoptee, and you talk to other adoptees, they seem to get it too. And so there's not a lot of things we have to really educate each other on our own experiences. And so that's really what I like so much about it, is to provide that for adopted people who have been in my shoes before as a client.
What is going on with the bills? Can you give us a short synopsis on open bills opportunities to get involved?
It's so busy right now. There's so many bills that are being introduced and are active, and it's pretty typical. And I'm sort of a super crossword solver, and I do the New York Times crossword every day electronically. And so last year when I looked back to see what I'd done, I had 0 crosswords done from January through probably May. And then I do them every day after that. But because it's so busy, there's so many things to keep track of. But I'd say that the biggest opportunities, at least for birth records issues, that's for getting the original birth record, will be to watch Michigan and Georgia. I think they may be the 2 next states. They're doing really great work down in Georgia. I'm part of a coalition in Michigan. They've each passed one of the chambers. They passed the Senate in Georgia, the House in Michigan. So getting pretty close in both of those. California is always a huge state. It's a hard state to generally work in because it's so big and so populous, and it's also a very restricted state when it comes to original birth records. It's one of the most restricted states in the country. And so the adoption attorney industry there is very strong. The adoption agency industry is very strong, and it's very hard to counteract the narrative that they have and the concerns that they believe would happen if they were to release a single piece of paper. So I'm always optimistic, but very cautious in some of those states. Yeah.
Something's going on in Virginia right now as well, right?
Yeah, Virginia, like last year, a bill popped out of nowhere, and we weren't expecting a bill this year either, and suddenly it popped up again. And so it has gone through committee. It's ready to go to the House for consideration. And this is what's so interesting about this work legislatively. The opposition this time is coming from a number of Democrats. And this is always a nonpartisan issue, but it becomes a partisan issue when the parties are just jockeying for power. So in one state, it may be a Republican sponsored and pushed bill like it is in Georgia. In other states, it may be democratically controlled and pushed, which it was in Minnesota when they just passed their new law last year. And in Virginia, which is very divided. I mean, the margins between the Democrats and the Republicans are very small. So this is a bill carried by a Republican, and the Democrats probably are not wanting to see success by the other party. And so we get caught up in that because we're not a big issue. It's not a big issue. It's not like abortion. It's not like immigration where, the parties have their own ideology. There is no really ideology on this issue at a party level. It's whether they get it and who wants to get in the way of passing these bills. And typically it's the right to life folks. It could be the Catholic Church. Or it could be people who have this mythology of adoption that it should always be closed and always be secret. And often it's typically older legislators who may have been aware of this closed era, baby scoop era of adoption and feel that that's the norm, when in fact it's not the norm. And the reasons they sealed the records aren't the reasons they think it was for.
I know there are a lot of adoptive parents who are also, in different legal positions. And does that factor in as well?
I think it goes both ways. I think, as we all know, some adoptive parents are really threatened by opening up records and believing, maybe probably erroneously, but maybe that their relationship with their children is going to be ruined by allowing this knowledge to be shared and to be available. So you have that threat. You have some adoptive parents who are staunch advocates for this right for their own children. And so I think it always just comes down to what their belief is about adoption generally, and what it means to be an adoptive parent, and also how they perceive their child and how autonomous or independent they allow that child to be. It really is it's all about autonomy of the adopted individual. And as an adult, the autonomy should be in full force. Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, in Minnesota, we had a very strong adoptive parent who was very much behind the bill and had helped it for decades at least. Staunch Bastard Nation member, and so you certainly have those advocates there. I think there's the same thing in Georgia. You have some really staunch advocates who are adoptive parents in Georgia.
I think you're spot on about your point on autonomy and how parents view their child's eventual and ultimate autonomy. But I thought it might be worth having you speak a little bit about what secrecy was supposed to protect and what it ends up protecting, because some of the opposition is not quite as above board as we might think. Can you speak to that, Greg?
Yeah, so they sealed the records in the first place. I mean, California was the first state they did it, and the reason the legislator said he wanted to pass this law in 1935 was to prevent continued blackmail of adoptive parents, meaning that for some reason they're going to tell the parents that the kid's adopted. So I guess people were, obviously hiding their adoptive status from their children at that point, and it became a way to blackmail them through the records that were available on request. So they sealed that in California, but it's always not been about the secrecy and the alleged anonymity of birth parents. It's always about trying to strengthen the adoptive family and not and perceiving the birth parents as threats to that that adoptive family to grow strong. And so if you've ever talked, and I'm sure you have, and one of you is a birth parent, ever talked to them, the experience, at least in the 40s, 50s, 60s, probably for decades after, was not of an empowering experience to relinquish a child. It was an experience in which you were told to forget about it, to you'll never see this child again, to put it behind you, and do not interfere with the adoptive family now that you're out of the picture. So it was never about this anonymity that arose. Essentially, I see it as a marketing tool for adoption agencies. Come to us, it's completely anonymous. We'll facilitate the adoption. You can walk away from it and not worry about it ever again, which is a false promise in all sorts of senses. But I think it was a marketing ploy on the part of adoption agencies to say that they had this promise of anonymity. In the same way that we're seeing with safe haven laws, and now this new threat of baby boxes, where you could just put it in a box and walk away and not be affected by it, which, as we all know, you are affected by it for life as a birth parent.
One thing that really that surprised me, that I learned along the way about protecting anonymity of birth parents, is that records are not sealed with relinquishment, right? They're sealed upon adoption, which, to your point of being more adoptive parent centered than birth parent privacy centered and adoptee centered.
Yeah, that's so true. And we say that to every legislature. We say that, listen, this isn't about adoption. This is about, it's about when you, well, the birth record is independent of adoption. It exists outside of adoption, and it's going to exist for an archive, and it will be there available, as you say, if the adoption doesn't occur. So, okay, put pressure on the birth mom to relinquish a child for adoption. That transaction is done. Walk away, forget about it. But that child may not actually ever be adopted. And so that birth record's there. They can get it whenever they want, and they can go search for their birth parents if they choose to do so. Yeah.
I also wanted to add, because you mentioned the post-war baby scoop era and the not empowering experience, and I just wanted to give an update on the 2016 experience. Is still not an empowering experience. So I just wanted to clarify that while we don't send women away, we have not improved the experience, and I think by nature it's just not an empowering experience.
Right. The marketing has changed dramatically. But the underlying experience has not, is my understanding. It's like, now it used to be like shame, shame, shame. You need to have this child so you can get rid of the shame and live your life. Now it's like brave love. It's all brave. You're being brave by relinquishing. And so they've gone 180 degrees on.
There's also a hint of shame, though. They can't like help themselves. You know what I mean? They have to like sort of, it's a side dish. The shame is still, it's kind of a secret ingredient.
Or like its redemption is still available. Redemption is very much part of the category. Yeah.
Yes.
To answer Lori's question is, and a lot of people don't know this, and I think it's like in about 18 to 19 states, the decision to even have an amended record after the adoption was up to the adoptive parents. they could make that decision. If they didn't want an amended birth record and just would use the decree and the original as the identification papers, they could do that. And so even it wasn't up to the birth parent to insist on anonymity, or they had no power to do that, and it's not possible. But it was completely under the control of the adoptive parents to seal that record and have it forever sealed.
And I also just like to say that transparency overall is a good thing for everybody involved, including adoptive parents, because we know what's going on. And one of the side effects of closed records is hiding bad actors. And I'm not saying all actors in agencies, ethical agencies, are bad, but we know that there have been practices that have been hidden by under the ruse of closing records. People can't put pieces together, like adoptive parents can't put pieces together to find out what actually happened and how above board their adoption really was. And I would like to believe that most of them care about that.
Right. I agree. I think most do care about that. And we've seen that most prominently in intercountry adoption, when they find out that the children were, and the birth mother was essentially duped into relinquishing a child when they thought the child was just going to go to the United States for an education, then come back. So the cultural, on top of all that, is this sort of cultural, taking advantage of the cultural misunderstanding of what adoption really is. Yeah. And I agree with you too. It is, I think that it's, especially years ago and probably continuing, it is a way to hide bad practices when you're essentially immune from releasing any information, and that information is so hard to get. There's an interesting issue that's been, and this is one that's arisen now in 2 states that I'd love to get your perspective on this. It first arose in Vermont, and we dealt with it fairly well, and still got the law passed there. But it's now arising in Michigan, where we have a coalition that works to end domestic and sexual violence and represents women, largely women, in that context. And they are right now opposed to our bill because they believe that it would lead to disclosure of the woman who was a survivor of sexual assault or domestic abuse, and would lead to trauma, additional trauma because of that. And so obviously what I tell them, especially today, well, we could either have this sort of discreet and very private release of a birth record, and the adoptee does what they want with it. And nowadays we are also using, not in all states, but in some, a contact preference form that a birth parent can fill out saying, I'd like contact, or I'd prefer it through an intermediary if we have contact, or I don't want contact, but if I change my mind, I'll file something else. And so that is a way of providing agency to the birth mom who's concerned about that issue. And but when I tell them that if we don't have that, the use of consumer DNA testing makes it far worse for everybody, because you're then using DNA. Increasingly, you'll get a first or second cousin match. You'll have those second cousins, suddenly they have a mystery on their hands and they want to solve it, because who doesn't want to solve a genealogical mystery? And you're having them asking about who in the family relinquished a child for adoption in 1975 or 1989 or whatever. And what was supposed to be a fairly private matter, I think it is a private matter when you relinquish a child. I think there is intense need for confidentiality at the time of relinquishment. No one's sitting in that room with the social worker listening to the conversation about that decision, nor are we asking for records that document that decision. But that information is then spread across an entire family, as opposed to just being discreetly released on a birth record. And they still don't get it. They still want to oppose the bill.
And many times also in domestic violence situations, sometimes the abuser is in the family and in the home. And so many times, I mean,
Right.
so it's not even a rare thing. I mean, that's very common in domestic violence scenarios. And so, or there can be multiple abusers. And so are you giving it through consumer DNA? Is this information traveling to the wrong hands? You have absolutely no control over the passage of that information and
Right.
who comes across it.
I mean, my mom used to run a domestic violence intervention service, and I would be in the office sometimes, and she would tell me about death threats that she would get, or how it would be directed at her as the director, not even as the survivor of domestic abuse. And so I'm certainly aware and very much aware of that issue.
Yeah, I used to work at an agency, and I've answered the phone for women in crisis, in the aftermath of an immediate abusive domestic violence situation. And it's terrifying and heart-wrenching and all of the things to listen to a woman so desperate, and she's pregnant and she's been beaten, but all of those things don't mean that she doesn't want to be connected with her child, and like a contact form would denote that. And so this isn't all one big mess of a situation. We can kind of take out the pieces and figure it out. It's not so complex that we would have to oppose an open records bill on those grounds.
Right. I agree with you completely. It doesn't provide agency and power. I believe in empowering people. By opposing it, they're going to disempower the people they serve.
Well, and also I just think you can't not talk about the trauma for people of living their entire life, not knowing anything about their child and the outcome, and are they okay? And I would imagine in some of those cases, the decisions are based on helping save a child from a really dangerous person in the family. And so there's already a mode of caring and protection that parent is coming from. And so that doesn't just disappear because the child is not in the home. It's very traumatic to stuff grief and all the questions and wondering for a woman. So that's a lifetime. I have my birth mother to look at to see what happens. That's trauma. That's more trauma, not knowing the uncertainty and knowing nothing.
It's so interesting when you do this advocacy all the time, you begin to realize that adoptees become sort of this vessel for legislators and others to pour their concerns into, when it may not even have anything to do with adoption. We're dealing with different issues here, but they want to, and we're always infantilized as well, because we're seen as this needy child that wants their record, and we're seen as people who are going to just willy-nilly go contact their birth mom, no matter what kind of preference may have been recorded on a piece of paper, which has never been my experience with talking with any adopted person ever. They take it very seriously. There's a real risk of being rejected. There's a real hurt and trauma from being rejected by a birth parent. They're going to be rejected in a contact preference form as well, and that's something they're going to have to deal with. And but yeah, that we're vessels to pour these issues into, and if we're constantly having to play whack-a-mole with them all the time. I'm always amazed at the number of issues that come up when we're requesting is our own birth record.
That's a lot of intersectionality, the situation that you brought up. And what comes to mind for me, Greg, is all will be revealed eventually,
Exactly.
Whether it's through legitimate or legal means, by open records with transparency, or by illegitimate means under the radar through DNA tests, consumer DNA sites. And Susan Ito brought this point forward in her recent book, I Would Meet You Anywhere. Claudia Corrigan Darcy has mentioned it as well, that if you want this to remain a private matter, make it above board, not below board, because then you have to, people. The reason prohibition didn't work is because people felt like they had a right to beer and wine, which has been with human throughout recorded history. People feel like they have a right to their earliest chapters of their lives. That this is not going to go away with legislation. People will find ways to get their answers, legitimately or illegitimately.
Exactly right. If you get a denial, let's say, and your birth record is not released because in some states that ability, that power is available to birth parents, that just incentivizes you. That just encourages you to use other tools. And it just happens that DNA currently is a fairly effective and inexpensive tool, but we had tools in the past, social media, we had private investigators, we had this legendary searcher that you give a wad of cash to, and he had access to microfiche. And so that's always existed. And if you had the means to find, you would find out what happened. And that's actually been an interesting, successful argument for some legislators. You say, well, if you have the means, if you're wealthy, you can certainly get your records or find out who it is. And they say, well, that's the legislators say, well, that's not fair. And then they'll come over to our side on an issue because of it's just not fair to the little guy. Yeah.
In my mind, I just think about, the premise of Adoption Unfiltered in our book, and our goal is, to bring people together to work together because we believe that we're better together and stronger together. Not to discount our own soul communities because those are life-giving in a lot of ways as well. But there's a time and a place to all pull together and work towards a common goal. How do you, I guess, envision that, and what would you like to see in that, coming from that going forward?
That's a great question. I mean, you could talk about it, the finances, or you could talk about it in terms of how do you work together with, especially in the context of your own book, with birth parents, adoptive parents, and adoptees. I think part of the thing is, I think, let's just say that from the perspective of an adopted person, I think we have to find our own strength first, before we're strong enough to ally with others. And you have to understand what it means to be an ally, whether I'm an ally to birth parents who want, let's say birth parents want to get the original birth record because they're on it. I mean, I'd certainly ally on that issue. Or adoptive parents want to change in how they can register an intercountry adoption in the state, so it doesn't cost so much, because it's kind of ridiculous in some ways where the adoption's already occurred overseas. I could certainly ally on something like that, but it's not my issue, not generally my issue, or is it an adopted person issue? So both finding our own community strength, but using that strength to be an ally on other issues that aren't fully our issues. And so birth parents, I think, and adopted parents are natural allies on the original birth record. But they have to understand that they are allies and not leaders on that. Yeah, and it goes to vice versa. So I'll stand by and be an ally to any group that wants to do something that's positive for that group. Yeah, I mean, Kelsey, we've talked about some of the federal legislation that's going forward related to regulating unlicensed adoption agencies or unlicensed facilitators and intermediaries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's certainly something, it doesn't really affect adult adopted people, which is really our group, but it certainly affects birth parents. And that's something that could be, and possibly, and adopted parents as well. And it's something that could be an ally on.
I think it affects the adoptees as well. I always think about Sarah's story because Sarah was adopted in like what she calls a gray market adoption, basically a physician facilitated adoption, in the Wild West in Montana. And so I think of Sarah's story, and I think about it often with my work with the Adopt Act that would prohibit these unlicensed intermediaries, of which includes a physician, because I look at how that piece of Sarah's story has affected her, emotional and mental well-being. And it's my child, he's gonna be 8 this year, but he's gonna be in his 50s one day, and he's gonna still be affected by the story. So there are children being adopted every day. I think those issues, that's one of the things about, this adoption law reform. It affects you at some point, you may not grasp how it affects you today because you're an infant, but one day you won't be. So yeah, but I've loved collaborating as much as we've been able to, which hasn't been a ton, but it's from what we've, spoken about or talked about legislation wise, state by state or federal. I've enjoyed your perspective and your work, and I totally respect everything that Adoptees United and Adoptee Rights Law Center is doing. And so we're really grateful for your work. And if you are an adoptive parent and you're listening and you're like, where do I put my money? Here's a place where you could put your money.
Tax deductible. Yeah.
This is tax deductible. And I can assure you that it is going to be used in the right way.
We talked about infinite money, and that is such a limiting, not having that resource of the financial resource to do things is a really limiting factor within the adoptee rights community. Totally. And money is a weird thing in that space too, because we come from a transaction in many respects that involved money. And so I think adoptees are very wary of money in the space of adoptee rights, but I think we have to get over that. And I think we have to recognize that we're limited in what we can do if we don't have the resources to do it. And so I'm wide open about, we need to raise money. We need money. We also pay the people that who speak at our events, because we feel that's something that we need to build in, so that's part of the organization as a whole. But one federal bill like everyone should ally on is this kind of crazy bill that you would think we wouldn't need today, but it's called the Adoption Counts Act, in which they would actually start counting adoptees again from private adoptions, because they stopped counting us. And so we have no idea how many adoptees are in the US.
I did a briefing on that act in the House in November.
How'd it go?
Great.
Seems like a no-brainer,
It does seem like a no-brainer. It seems like it should have been a no-brainer in 1975, if you ask me. But yeah, so no, and we're looking for co-sponsors, and we are also a small organization, Ethical Family Building. So it's, I'm sure you understand when you're spread thin. We've been going all in on the Adopt Act, but adoption counts is something that's still extremely important. Federal data is the basis of, data in general is the basis of policy change in so many ways, because you can walk into a representative or senator's office and say, I need this change. And they say, show me the data. And you're like, well, we don't have any.
Exactly. We get that at the state level too, all the time.
Cycle of nothingness, because we're just trying to invent some basic level of precedent to go off of. And so this is, I would say that's one of the most important efforts happening this year is the Adoption Counts Act. So
yeah, and we all need, and you sound like you need some infinite money as well. So
yeah.
Because that's the thing, is like we could all do so much more, and I'm at absolute capacity, so that people ask me to testify and I feel bad. I can't. I can't. I just don't have the time.
What what though, I think that speaks volumes to why working together is so important, because we can't do everything. I can't do everything, you can't do everything, and constituent power shouldn't be overlooked, because it's important and valued, especially in an election year. And so we should have people around the country that can go testify if we can't.
Right.
We're just stronger together. So yeah.
I'd just like to make a real quick note to adoptive parents who are wondering why they would want to put their money behind some of these efforts. One, you want your child to count. And two, you want your child to have equal access to their birth records the way other Americans do in all states. So
right. And I'd say this too, the effort to get citizenship for intercountry adoptees who lack it is incredibly expensive for my clients. I think it should be free. I think this is a clinic that Adoptees United will be forming to represent intercountry adoptees that don't have U.S. citizenship. And I'm been really surprised on the number of clients I have that are estranged from their adoptive parents and don't have their adoptive parents as a resource for that financial hit. and even some that are in good stead with their adoptive parents, but the adoptive parents aren't picking up that cost. So I'm just shocked by that, actually. But yeah, we talk about infinite money, that's where I would put a big chunk of it to get rid of this issue of lack of citizenship.
Do you foresee the Adoptee Citizenship Act coming back anytime?
It's obviously it's federal level, it's immigration, it's a divided House and Senate,
Not
and
a
we've got
good topic right now.
yeah, and so immigration is something that they'll only talk about the border, or they'll talk about asylum, or both, and they're not talking about a path to citizenship for anyone, and it's not going to happen at least in 2024, and then we'll have to see who's standing in next year for to be the next president.
And can
so
one of you say in like 1 or 2 sentences what this means for adoptees who were brought in through intercountry adoption and don't have citizenship? How could that have happened?
So it happened because it affects, for the most part, older adopted people who were essentially under or over 18 in 2001 when this new law, now an old law, went into effect. And so for the older adoptees, there was no such thing as acquired or what's called automatic citizenship once that adoption was finalized. And so their parents had to get them naturalized. And if they didn't get them naturalized, they've been going through the world as a legal permanent resident. Basically, you have a green card. And many have voted. Some have committed a crime. And because of one of those issues, typically, they may not be eligible to naturalize. And so they're sort of stuck in this limbo. And I have clients that are sort of just staying low and don't want to come to the attention of anyone. But it affected largely older adopted people who were born before 1983, whose parents did not get them naturalized.
So we're seeing people being deported back to a country they don't know, to a language they don't speak, because of something that their adoptive parents maybe didn't know needed to happen when that law changed in 2001 after
Right.
9/11. And now there's no legal recourse. They get on the
Right.
radar and they can't get a passport, can't.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what I do is I represent those adoptees in all sorts of different situations. Some don't even have a green card, but the ones that have a green card and don't have these factors like voting or criminal conviction, I will help them naturalize. I'll represent them to naturalize. I would love to see a fund available to adoptees, intercountry adoptees that could tap into that, because it's just the filing fee itself to naturalize is $725. I'm doing the work for free, but if they're to pay an attorney, that's probably at least another $1,500 to $2,000. And so it's very expensive, and they just don't do it. They may not have the means to do it. Yeah. So Adoptee Citizenship Act, maybe in 2025, it just depends upon, what happens in 2024. But I don't see it happening currently.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we'll keep tabs on that. Any concluding thoughts? Any last thoughts about anything you want to give I don't know, a shout out to pay attention to, or wrap up thoughts?
Well, I would certainly tell people, and I've been telling people a lot, to pay attention to these baby box bills. They are crazy, and they are spreading like wildfire. I'm shocked to see one now in Washington State. I'm shocked to see one now in New Hampshire. And this is sort of the baby scoop era through an incubator in the wall of a fire station. And so if we don't understand this and understand what it means and what it's really not addressing, then we're going to, 5 years from now, there's going to be a baby box in every fire station. And it's going to lead to one thing. It will lead to more abandonments of children, not for any good purpose.
The Washington State, it's a bill right now, right? It's not passed.
Right, it's a bill. It's in the House and
Sarah,
Senate.
that's you. So you're on it.
I
right?
know. I have to get on that. I know. I'm
I'll
very
talk to you about it
concerned about
because there's a
these.
small group of adoptees there finally where we might have to, will be activated on this bill.
Okay, well,
Well,
let's connect
Yeah.
about it.
had
Yeah.
we had a book tour event in Seattle and then on Vashon Island out in Washington. And Vashon was a very small event, and we didn't know anyone really there except for a couple people that Sarah knew and her family. But all of a sudden, like the library, the small library room that we had filled up, and we had everybody introduce themselves because it was an intimate event, and they were all adoptees. And Sarah didn't know. And they were all these adoptees, and we were like, oh, put your name on an email here, because now you guys are going to start an adoptee group on Vashon Island. So I think they need to mobilize, Sarah. I
Well,
think
we
it's
are.
time.
I just got
Oh,
everything
okay,
is
great.
all. I didn't even tell you this today when we met earlier, but I am officially the facilitator of Adoptees Connect Vashon Island.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it's really awesome. So our first meeting is in a few weeks, and I think I've got someone to co-facilitate with me, another adoptee, and we have someone very passionate about legislation who came to the event too, Bastard
She's from
Nation.
Bastard Nation. Mhm.
Yeah,
So is that Marley?
yeah.
No.
Oh, because she's
We better not
she
name
is the leader on the
Yeah.
opposition to this.
We shouldn't.
We won't name
Yes,
her. Yes.
Marley.
Oh yeah,
But
that's
it
fine.
wasn't
Yeah,
Marley. I know Marley. It was somebody. I don't want to name her though,
that's fine.
because
Yeah,
I don't want to. But
But it was exciting. So anyway,
Yeah,
all I'm saying is
that's
yes,
awesome.
we can mobilize. We have some
maybe
people.
you guys
Maybe
can do a letter writing event in your first.
Sarah, I'll reach out to we'll get in contact with the other two adoptees that are involved in this as well.
okay,
And
that's
who are
awesome.
connected to the legislature too, which is really good.
That's
Or
good. You know,
connected to that process.
I would love that. I would really love that. And I just through Adoptee Voices, we just supported two bills, Michigan and I think Georgia. I think
Oh, that's right. You wrote a letter from
yeah.
Michigan. Yeah.
Yeah, we did. And that I have to admit, I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but that was my first kind of foray into any adoptee rights work. And so I think it just always has seemed really legal and daunting. And so I would love to ask you, Greg, like for adoptees who care, we care, but it feels really daunting. What what are the best ways to get involved? Is it just
So
through
yeah, I think it's
finding
with
others?
I would try to get involved with Adoptees United, because as these things pop up, we have a large database now that we would send out, say, hey, there's a bill in your state, and this is a group that's in your state you may want to align with. That's one way. But you're a storyteller, and that's really what testifying is about. That's really what it's about, to meet with legislators. You're telling a story. You have to, I mean, in that context, you have to be extremely brief, but it is, the stories are what that matters. And Kelsey mentioned constituent power, and that still is a very powerful thing. Constituent power really drives, especially in this issue. Let's say it's the original birth record issue. In that issue where no one really knows about it, and they're often surprised that, whoa, you have two birth certificates and you can't get your original one. It's those stories that matter so much in that, and they meet people who are affected by it and who are constituents, and they can actually do something about it. So it is daunting. I agree with that. I mean, I didn't start really lobbying at capitals and for maybe 2 years ago was when I first started doing that. And it's you get nervous and you think, everything's on the line, when in fact they're people too, those legislators, and they just want to hear your story and see what they can contribute if they can. So yeah, keep at it. And the letters are really useful as well.
Before we close, I want to back up to the issue of the baby boxes, because that's so important. I think we need to do another whole episode about it to flesh that out. We kind of threw that in when we're almost out of time.
I know.
So we will put in the show notes on this episode when we have a new episode that explores that. So just check the show notes if you're watching this a bit later.
Great, thank you.
Greg, we're so grateful that you came on to talk to us, and we'll be keeping up on your work and the work of Adoptees United. And so, yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, rate, and share wherever you listen to help others find Adoption Unfiltered. It's through healthy engagement that we can make the changes needed for all those affected by adoption. Visit adoptionunfiltered.com for other episodes and more information about our other projects, including our brand new book, Adoption Unfiltered.